I mean, the sad realities is that before the colonial era, the predominant version of Islam all around the Muslim world was Sufism. That's just a fact, a historical fact. Uh, the I've dedicated so much of my life to demonstrate that nationalism, which took out the non-Arab elements because of the Arab rebellions, and took out the Turks, took out the Malays, took them out of the equation of Islamicity, and by doing that, it also took out a lot of the wind out of Sufism, because Islam spread in Indonesia and Malaysia and Philippines and through Sufism, so through Sufi organizations or Sufi movements. And Wahhabism became the dominant form of Islam in the Arab world, and then by extension the dominant form of immigrant Islam in the West. And that's the thing that converts encounter. Wahhabi Islam is very arid, is very austere. It doesn't talk about humility. It doesn't talk about gratitude. It doesn't talk about spiritual. It doesn't talk about for Sufis, imagination is proof of the divine. If you want to see that there is a God, reflect upon imagination, because no machine can create it. But in Wahhabism, imagination is the door to the devil. Is the door of fitna. Mm-hmm. And that is why they say music is haram, twirling dervishes are haram, everything is a bid'ah. There was a guy after my last khutbah in the Islamic Center that came and said, this mosque, they read Quran before the khutbah. This is a bid'ah. He told them not to read Quran, and I said, what, do you want people to sit and gossip? He said, it's better than this bid'ah of reading Quran before the... even gossip would be better than... It's a very myopic, didactic form of Islam, this Wahhabi theology. Unfortunately, the reality is Wahhabi Islam is the dominant form of Islam among Muslim institutions in the West. That's in large part because of the retreat of the wealth of Saudi Arabia and the wealth of the Gulf countries and their ability to mobilize money, but also the retreat of very rich cultural elements in the Islamic tradition, like the Turks, like the Malays, like the Filipinos, from the mainstream picture. Because the nuance that they brought to the picture and their traditions of spirituality are remarkably rich and nuanced. Now, of course, having said all of that, for someone like our convert friend to say that's all very interesting, but what do we do, right? I think you must be like the first Muslims. Like the khutbah I gave about declaring I am the first of Muslims. There are plenty, like for instance, Omid Safi wrote a book about the brother of Hamid al-Ghazali, Muhammad al-Ghazali, not the new, Ahmad al-Ghazali. Ahmad al-Ghazali, who wrote a very profound work on Sharia and love. If I was a convert Muslim, I would get all my fellow converts, you would get a book like that, and read it, study it, internalize it, and memorize it. Because that will teach you much more than any of the Wahhabi type imams that you encounter in Islamic centers. It will teach you the beauty and power of Iman and the power of Islam, and you will walk around with your head held high because you know the truth is in your heart, and no one can touch it. And there are other books like that. I mean, and I think part of what we should do is you should pin me down and force me to give you the names of books. Like, because we can have a list of 50 books. Like,
well, we have some, but we're going to do it
there
again.
are, since with that last list, there are many others that came out. There's a book on love in the Quran that was written by a guy called Ghazi. You know, of course, no one paid him any attention, but it's a great book. It's a study of the tradition of the way that Quran talks about love.
Is it in Arabic?
In English. It's in English. It's called Love in the Quran.
What about, I've heard certain people say that certain Sufi sheikhs elevate to a point where they can drink and smoke and get high, and then they actually do this.
You know, I've known a lot of Sufi shuyukh, and every Sufi sheikh that I've known has been more. The difference is that they don't display their piety in public for showmanship, but in my experience, they have been more pious than I could ever be. I mean, they give me a complex by the number of prayers they do every day, the number of days they fast, the number of dhikr they continue every day. Now, someone said, but you know, I am sure there's out there some Sufi sheikh, and I say, like who? They, well, I've read somewhere like Ibn Arabi, considered, also Ibn Arabi, the man insists that he was bound by every rule of Sharia, or maybe say it Hallaj, somewhat Hallaj. My response is, if you're Hallaj, then I and no one else is empowered to judge you. Then you know, you have such a relationship with Allah that all of humanity can't even understand. Because Hallaj was torn to pieces, dismembered, and didn't utter a single scream because he was so intoxicated by God's presence he didn't feel any pain. So that level is like superhuman. You can just stand there in awe and not say anything. So it's one of these false paradigms. You know, it's like someone tells me that, and I say, well, you know, I know a lot of. It's as if responding, say, well, a lot of Wahabi shuyukh, they all have mut'am, siyar marriages and married children, and it's propaganda. It's not real life. Give me a Sufi sheikh that sits there and drinks and doesn't follow the rules and so on. I mean, it's just propaganda. Do you know anyone?
No.
I don't know anyone.
No, Rumi writes a lot about wine.
So do I. And I've never tasted wine in my life. I mean, it's the idea of intoxication. I've been intoxicated in God. And I imagine alcohol, and I just imagine it because I've never been intoxicated by alcohol. And I never tasted alcohol. But I imagine intoxication by alcohol would be something like that. So do I. So what? And I write a lot about love. It doesn't mean I'm promiscuous or that I've ever, you know, so what? And this is, by the way, takes us to when, you know, our pretentious intellectuals, when they have all this big deal about my friend, rahmahullah, Shab Ahmad's book, What is Islam, who says, oh, look, you know, the Muslims throughout history, when I say my friend is because we were friends, he has passed away, but he wrote a book called What is Islam, and all these intellectuals are so excited about the book because he erroneously and unfortunately argues that Muslims have defined Islam in all these ways that are inconsistent with Sharia, and he concludes from that Sharia is irrelevant and unimportant. It's completely false. I mean, you can't rely on the imagination of poets in order to describe sociological reality. You write poetry yourself, you know that. Sharif wrote a poem about the dust of books becoming twirling dervishes. I don't think it means it actually happened, but, you know.
To me it did.
Yeah, to you.
Told you. I said this is not symbolic. Whatever.
Isn't it innovation part of believer's life? It's an integral part to a Muslim to be innovative. It's
Absolutely. I mean, and in fact, when anyone says bid'ah, remember that in theology there is an innovation, bid'ah sayyi'ah, bad innovation, and bid'ah hasana, a good innovation. And so when someone says innovation, it reflects an ignorance and it's as I said, it's the Najdis throughout Islamic history were known. If you the remarkable thing about history is that the Najdis, where Wahhabism emerged, were known. The tribes of Najd were known for their hard-headedness. They're like we call some of the Sa'ida in Egypt, people from South Egypt, hard-headed, black and white. They had a very even their poetry is all about cattle and camels and very little about love, very little about flowers, very little about water. It's so when the Najdis emerged with their brand of Islam, it was understandable that they would have that brand because they've had it for centuries. But what was not imaginable is that they would take over Hijaz, because Hijaz was always a cultural center of diversity. And that they would spread their influence into Kufa and Iraq, and that they would spread their influence into Yemen, and then they spread their influence into Egypt and onwards. That is an unprecedented in Islamic history. And then their influence would extend all the way to India, and it was truly revolutionary. And coupled with the retreat of the dominant intellectual power for several centuries, right before that happened, and that's the Ottoman Turks. You had the Ottoman Turks retreat suddenly, so the entire institutional framework became destabilized overnight, and it was in a complete collapse.
Britain and Saudi Wahhabi forces.
Of course, they worked in tandem, and that's why
ripped it off.
Yeah, and that's why the Islamophobes, when you point the finger and say colonialism worked hand in hand with Wahhabism to roll back all types of Islam except Bedouin Islam, Najdi Islam, the Islamophobes go nuts. They start attacking you. That's the reason I've been called stealth Islamist and all the conspiracy stuff. It's really because of that. Because they know that if Muslims become fully aware that Wahhabi Islam could have never become what it is if it hadn't been for colonialism, a whole revolution would take place. And so they freak out. And that's the part that they hate the most. And that's the part that also is the cause for the attempts on my life. There were 3 attempts. And I completely believe that it was because of that. Because of that little part, the intimate relationship between Bedouin, Najdi, Wahhabi Islam, and colonialism. To our very day.